The lightning split the sky like God himself had torn the heavens open, and Natalie Winters knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die out here in this God-forsaken wilderness with her unborn child still trapped inside her body. The wagon had lost a wheel 3 miles back. Her husband's body lay cold beneath a tarp in the bed where he had been for the past 2 days, and the contractions that had started as a dull ache that morning now seized her entire body with a violence that made her scream into the howling wind. Rain lashed against her face as she stumbled forward through the mud, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other reaching desperately toward the flickering light she could barely make out through the sheets of water cascading from the black sky. It was a building of some kind, maybe a house, maybe salvation, and she forced her legs to keep moving even as another contraction brought her to her knees in the mud. She did not know how long she crawled. Time had become meaningless, measured only in the spaces between waves of pain that threatened to split her apart. Her fingers clawed at the earth, her dress soaked through and weighing her down like an anchor trying to drag her into the ground. The baby was coming whether she reached shelter or not, and the thought of dying here in the mud with her child filled her with such desperate terror that she found the strength to push herself upright one more time. The barn loomed before her suddenly, massive and dark against the storm-lit sky. She had not even realized she had made it this far. The doors hung open, banging against the frame with each gust of wind, and she half fell through the entrance into the smell of hay and horses and blessed dryness. The pain came again, harder this time, and she collapsed onto the straw-covered floor with a cry that was lost in the thunder. Jesus Christ! The voice came from somewhere above her, rough and startled. "Madam? Madam, what in the hell are you doing out in this storm?" Natalie could not answer. She could barely see through the tears and rain streaming down her face, could barely think past the agony radiating from her core. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, turning her gently onto her back, and then a man's face swam into view above her. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and eyes that went wide with shock as he took in her condition. "Oh God," he said, "oh God, you're about to have a baby." "My husband," Natalie gasped out between pants. "Dead. Wagon broke. Please, please help me." The man's face went pale, but he did not hesitate. He stripped off his coat and bunched it under her head, then moved down to lift her sodden skirts. "My name is Kade Ximenes," he said, his voice tight but steady. "I am going to help you through this, do you understand? You are not going to die out here. Neither is your baby." "I do not know what to do," Natalie sobbed. "I do not know how to do this." "Well, I have delivered my fair share of foals and calves," Kade said, positioning himself between her legs with a grim determination that would have been funny under any other circumstances. "Cannot imagine it is too different. You just focus on breathing, madam. What is your name?" "Natalie. Natalie Winters." "Well, Natalie Winters, you are doing just fine. The baby is crowning already, which means you are going to meet your child real soon. When the next contraction comes, I need you to push as hard as you can." The storm raged outside with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. Rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 drum beats, and the wind screamed through the gaps in the walls with an almost human voice. But inside, in the circle of lamplight that Kade had somehow managed to light while she was lost in her own world of pain, there was only the two of them, and the baby fighting to be born. Natalie pushed when he told her to push. She bore down with every ounce of strength left in her exhausted body, her hands fisted in the straw, her back arching off the ground. Kade's hands were gentle despite their roughness, guiding and supporting, and his voice remained calm even as she screamed loud enough to match the thunder. "That is it," he murmured. "That is it. You are doing so well. One more push, Natalie. Give me one more good push and we will have this baby." She did not think she had anything left to give, but she pushed anyway, and suddenly the pressure released all at once and the barn filled with a new sound beneath the storm. A baby's cry, thin and reedy but unmistakably alive, rose up into the rafters. "It is a boy," Kade said, and his voice cracked with wonder. "You have a son." Natalie collapsed back against the coat pillow, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and relief, and a dozen other emotions she could not name. Kade was moving quickly now, using his knife to cut the cord with practiced efficiency, then wrapping the baby in his own shirt before placing the squirming bundle on her chest. The infant was tiny and red and perfect, his little fists waving in the air as he wailed his displeasure at being thrust into this cold, loud world. "Hello," Natalie whispered, touching one trembling finger to his cheek. "Hello, little one. I am your mama." Kade sat back on his heels, his bare chest heaving with exertion, and dragged one hand across his face. There was blood on his hands and his pants, and he looked utterly exhausted. But when he met her eyes, he was smiling. "You did it," he said simply. "You both did it." The afterbirth came a few minutes later, and Kade handled that with the same calm competence he had shown through everything else. He found blankets somewhere in the darkness of the barn and wrapped them around both her and the baby, then fashioned a makeshift bed out of fresh hay covered with what looked like a canvas tarp. He moved her onto it with surprising gentleness, supporting her weight as though she were made of something precious and fragile, and only when she and the baby were settled did he finally pull on a fresh shirt from a trunk in the corner. "I am going to go check on your wagon," he said, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. "You said your husband is there?" Natalie nodded, unable to speak, past the sudden tightness in her throat. She had almost forgotten, in the chaos of the birth, that she was now alone in the world except for the tiny life cradled against her chest. "I am sorry for your loss, madam," Kade said quietly. "I will see to him proper, I promise. You just rest now. You are safe here." He disappeared into the storm, and Natalie was left alone with her son and the horses stamping quietly in their stalls and the rain drumming endlessly overhead. She should have been terrified, she thought distantly. She should have been devastated by everything that had happened in the past few days, but all she could feel was a bone-deep weariness and a strange, fragile sense of peace. Her baby was alive. She was alive. For this moment, that was enough. Kade returned perhaps half an hour later, soaked to the skin again and looking grim. "I brought what I could from your wagon," he said, setting down a wet bundle that she recognized as her traveling trunk. "Your husband. I put him in the shed out back. It is dry and secure. When the storm passes, we will figure out proper burial arrangements." "Thank you," Natalie managed. "Thank you for everything. I do not know what I would have done if I had not found your barn." "This is not my barn," Kade said, and there was something odd in his voice. "Well, I suppose it is now, in a manner of speaking. I just bought this property 3 weeks ago. Used to belong to a rancher named Morrison who moved back east. I have been fixing up the main house, trying to get it livable before winter sets in, but I have been sleeping out here with the horses most nights. Guess it is lucky I was here tonight." "Lucky," Natalie echoed. It seemed like too small a word for what had happened, for the miracle of this stranger's hands delivering her child into the world while hell itself raged outside. Kade moved around the barn with quiet efficiency, tending to his horses and checking the doors to make sure they were secure against the storm. He built up a small fire in an old brazier, carefully positioned away from the hay, and the warmth of it slowly began to seep into Natalie's bones. She fed the baby, marveling at how he knew instinctively what to do, and felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she could not have said whether they were from sorrow or joy or simple, overwhelming exhaustion. "You should sleep," Kade said, settling himself on the ground a respectful distance away. "You have been through something terrible tonight. Your body needs rest to recover." "I do not know if I can sleep," Natalie admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see William's face. My husband. He caught fever 4 days ago, and it took him so fast. One morning he was fine. joking about what we would name the baby, and by that evening he could barely speak. The next day he was gone. Kade's expression was full of sympathy. I am sorry, that's a hard thing, losing someone you love. We had only been married 8 months, Natalie said, and the words came pouring out of her as though a dam had broken. We were heading to Columbus, New Mexico, where his brother has a homestead. William said we could build a good life there, that there was opportunity in the territory for people willing to work hard. He was so excited about the baby, about starting our family, and now he is gone, and I do not even know if I can make it to Columbus by myself, and I have a newborn son who is depending on me for everything. Hey now, Kade said gently, do not start borrowing tomorrow's troubles tonight. You made it this far, did you not? Through a storm that would have killed most people, with a baby on the way and a broken wagon. That takes a kind of strength most folks do not have. You are going to be all right, Natalie Winters. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. But the future stretched out before her like a dark and treacherous road, and she could not see the path forward. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn, the rain gradually lessening to a drizzle and then stopping altogether. The wind died away to nothing, and in the sudden silence Natalie could hear birds beginning to sing, tentatively greeting the new day. She had dozed fitfully through the night, waking every time the baby stirred, and now in the gray pre-dawn light she felt hollowed out and fragile as an eggshell. Kade was already awake, standing in the barn doorway and looking out at the devastation the storm had wrought. Trees lay uprooted across the property, and the yard was a sea of mud and debris. In the growing light, Natalie could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor. His face was tanned and weathered despite his relative youth, with strong features that might have been handsome if not for the serious, almost stern expression he wore. There was something solid about him, something steady and reliable that made her feel safer than she had any right to feel given her circumstances. The road is going to be impassable for at least a few days, Giri, he said without turning around. Maybe longer. That much rain will have turned everything to soup, and the creek will be running high. Nobody is going anywhere until things dry out some. Natalie's heart sank. I cannot impose on your hospitality for that long. You have already done so much. Now Kade did turn, and his dark eyes were kind. Madam, you just had a baby in my barn, in the middle of a storm that probably would have killed you if you had been out in it much longer. You are not going anywhere for at least a week, maybe 2, and that is not negotiable. You need time to recover, and your son needs time to get a little stronger before you go traveling with him. Besides, he added with a small smile, I have plenty of room, and not much in the way of company out here. You would actually be doing me a favor. I cannot pay you, Natalie said miserably. We spent most of our money on the wagon and supplies. I have maybe $20 left to my name. I am not asking for payment, Kade said firmly. What kind of man would I be if I charged a widow woman for helping her in her time of need? No, you and the boy will stay here as my guests until you are well enough to travel, and that is the end of it. There was no arguing with the finality in his tone, and truthfully, Natalie did not have the strength to argue even if she had wanted to. She nodded mutely, clutching her son closer to her chest, and tried not to think about what came after. The days that followed took on a strange, dreamlike quality. Kade carried her into the main house that first morning, insisting that she would recover better in a real bed than on a pile of hay in the barn. The house was small but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room with a fireplace. It was sparsely furnished and clearly in the middle of renovation, with sawdust on the floors and tools scattered about, but it was clean and dry and infinitely better than anywhere Natalie had slept in the past 2 weeks of travel. Kade gave her the larger bedroom and moved his few belongings into the smaller one without complaint. He brought her meals and fresh water, changed the linens when needed, and never once made her feel like she was a burden despite the considerable disruption her presence must have caused to his life. He built a cradle for the baby out of an old crate and some soft blankets, and carved a small wooden horse that he hung above it on a string to give the infant something to look at. "What is his name?" Kate asked on the third day, watching as the baby slept peacefully in his makeshift bed. Natalie hesitated. "I do not know yet. William and I had talked about names, but we could never agree. He wanted to name a son after his father, but his father's name was Cornelius, and I just could not imagine calling my baby that." Cade laughed, a warm, rumbling sound that seemed to fill the room. "No, that would be a heavy burden to put on a child. What about names that mean something to you, maybe a place or a person who was important in your life?" "My father's name was Thomas," Natalie said slowly. "He died when I was 14, but he was a good man. Kind and gentle, with a laugh that could light up a whole room. I would like my son to grow up to be like him." "Thomas is a strong name," Kate agreed. "Thomas Winters. It suits him, I think." So Thomas he became, and saying the name aloud somehow made everything feel more real, more solid. This was her son, Thomas Winters, and she was his mother, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. As Natalie's strength gradually returned, she began to learn more about the man who had saved her life. Kade Ximenes was 26 years old, the son of a Mexican father and an Irish mother who had met in a mining town in Colorado and fallen improbably in love. He had grown up working ranches and farms across the Southwest, learning horses and cattle from his father and stubbornness from his mother, and had saved for years to buy his own piece of land. This property in New Mexico, 60 acres with water rights to the creek, represented everything he had worked for his entire adult life. "I want to build something that lasts," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Something I can pass down to my own children someday. I have spent my whole life working other people's land, making other people rich. I want this place to be mine, to belong to my family in a way nothing ever has before." "That is a good dream," Natalie said softly. Thomas was asleep in her arms, his tiny face peaceful in the fading light. "I hope you achieve it." "What about you?" Kate asked. "What are your dreams, Natalie Winters?" It was a question she had not allowed herself to think about in days. "I do not know anymore," she admitted. "I thought I knew what I wanted. A home, a family, a quiet life with William in Columbus. But now William is gone, and I do not know if I can make it to Columbus alone with a baby. And even if I do not know what kind of welcome I will receive from his brother. Charles did not approve of our marriage. He thought William was too young to settle down, that I was not good enough for the family. I do not know if he will help me or turn me away." Cade was quiet for a long moment. "You have options when foreigners," he said finally. "You do not have to go to Columbus if you do not want to. There are other places, other possibilities." "Such as?" He turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You could stay here." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Natalie's heart began to beat faster, and she told herself it was only surprise, only the shock of the unexpected offer. "I could not," she said, but the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Why not?" Cade leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. "Listen, I know this is forward and probably improper, and about a dozen other things I should not be saying to a woman who just lost her husband, but you need a place to stay and a way to support yourself and your son, and I need help with this ranch. Someone to manage the house and help with the animals and just be another pair of hands. It would not have to be charity. You would be working, earning your keep. We could make it a formal arrangement, all proper and legal, room and board in exchange for labor." "People would talk," Natalie said, even as part of her mind was already turning over the possibility, examining it from every angle. A widow woman living alone with a single man. It would not be considered respectable. "People always talk," Cade said with a shrug. "Cannot live your life based on what folks might whisper behind your back. Besides, you would not be alone. You would have Thomas with you, and that is about the best chaperone a woman could ask for, tiny and screaming at all hours." Despite herself, Natalie felt a smile tugging at her lips. It faded quickly, though, as reality reasserted itself. I do not know anything about ranching. I was raised in Philadelphia, for heaven's sake. The most rural thing I ever did before I married William was visit my aunt's house in the country for a week every summer. I can teach you, Kade said simply. Same as I can teach Thomas when he's old enough. Hell, you might even be good at it. You're certainly tough enough surviving what you did. Natalie looked down at her sleeping son, at his perfect tiny fingers curled against her chest, and tried to imagine their future. She saw two paths stretching before them. One led to Columbus, to the cold welcome of disapproving in-laws and a life of dependence and obligation. The other led here, to this raw new land, and this man who had delivered her baby with his own hands and asked nothing in return but the chance to help. Let me think about it, she said finally. This is not a decision I can make lightly. Of course, Kade agreed. Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless. But even as she said it, Natalie felt something inside her beginning to shift, like a compass needle swinging toward true north. William Winters was buried on a hill overlooking the creek 6 days after the storm. Kade fashioned a coffin from rough pine boards and dug the grave himself, refusing Natalie's offer to help despite her insistence that she was strong enough now. The local preacher came out from town to say words over the body, and the three of them, Natalie, Kade, and the preacher, stood in the hot sun while the man of God committed William's soul to heaven and his body to the earth. Natalie did not cry. She felt like she should, like there was something wrong with her for standing dry-eyed beside her husband's grave, but the tears simply would not come. She had cried herself empty in those first terrible days after William's death, and now she felt only a distant sort of sadness, a grief that was already beginning to fade into memory. She had loved William in her way, but it had been a brief love, a young love, and it felt somehow disrespectful to pretend to a depth of mourning she did not truly feel. Are you all right? Kade asked after the preacher had gone, his wagon rattling back down the road toward town. I do not know, Natalie admitted. They were walking back to the house, Thomas bundled in a sling against her chest in the way Kade's mother had apparently carried her babies. I feel like I should be more devastated than I am. Like there is something broken inside me that I can stand here and make practical plans about the future when my husband is not even cold in his grave. Grief is not the same for everyone, Kade said quietly. And you have a child to think about now. Sometimes survival has to come before mourning. Is that what I'm doing? Surviving? What else would you call it? Natalie had no answer for that. She shifted Thomas in the sling, feeling his warm weight against her body, and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. Guilt and relief and sorrow and something else, something she was afraid to examine too closely. Something that had to do with the way her heart sped up when Kade smiled at her, the way she found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, the way his presence made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since before William took ill. I think I want to stay, she said abruptly. Here, I mean, if the offer is still open, I want to accept your proposal about working for room and board. Kade stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated because of what I did. You do not owe me anything, Natalie. I know that, she said, but you were right about my options. I do not want to go to Columbus and beg for help from people who never wanted me and their family to begin with. And I do not want to go back east to Philadelphia and admit defeat, to let my mother say I told you so about marrying a man I barely knew and heading west. I want to build something here, for Thomas and for myself. If you are willing to teach me, I am willing to learn. The smile that spread across Kade's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then we have an accord, Mrs. Winters. Welcome to the ranch. They shook hands on it there beside the road, formal and proper. And Natalie tried to ignore the way her skin tingled where his fingers wrapped around hers. The next weeks passed in a blur of hard work and small discoveries. Natalie learned to milk the cows that Kade kept for his own use, her city soft hands gradually developing calluses from the unfamiliar work. She learned to collect eggs from the nervous hens and to scatter feed for the chickens at dawn and dusk. She learned which plants in the kitchen garden were herbs and which were weeds, and how to tell when the tomatoes were ripe for picking. Kade was a patient teacher, never mocking her ignorance or making her feel foolish for not knowing things that were second nature to him. He showed her how to read the weather by watching the clouds, how to gentle a nervous horse with a soft voice and patient hands, how to mix feed and mend fences, and 100 other tasks that made up the daily rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew and thrived, putting on weight until his newborn scrawniness gave way to satisfying rolls of fat at his wrists and thighs. He developed a personality, fussing when he was hungry and cooing with delight when Natalie sang to him. And Kade proved to be surprisingly good with the baby, often volunteering to walk him around the house when he was fussy so Natalie could get a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. "You are good with him?" Natalie observed one evening, watching as Kade bounced Thomas gently in his arms while the baby gummed happily on his own fist. "I like babies," Kade said with a shrug. "They are honest. If they are mad or happy or scared, they let you know right away. No games, no pretending to be something they are not. I respect that." "Were you close with your family?" Natalie asked. "You do not talk about them much." Something shadowed crossed Cade's face. "My mother died when I was 16. Fever took her, same as what took your William. My father, he sort of gave up after that. Started drinking heavy, could not hold a job. I took care of him as long as I could, but eventually I had to strike out on my own. He died 3 years ago. Liver finally gave out. I got word from a friend who found him in a boarding house in Santa Fe." "I am so sorry," Natalie said softly. "That must have been hard, losing them both." "It was," Kade agreed. "But it also taught me something. Life is short and it is hard, and you cannot count on anything being permanent. That is why I want to build this ranch, why I am so determined to make something that will last. I want to create something stable and good, something that cannot be taken away by bad luck or bad choices." Natalie understood that impulse all too well. Stability was what she craved too, security for herself and for Thomas. But there was something else growing alongside that need for security, something warm and fragile that bloomed in her chest whenever Kade laughed, or when their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same tool, or when she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. It was improper, she told herself sternly. It was too soon, barely 2 months since William's death. She should not be noticing the way Cade's shirt pulled tight across his shoulders when he worked, should not be wondering what it would feel like to run her fingers through his dark hair, should not be lying awake at night thinking about the gentleness in his hands when he had delivered her baby, and wishing he would touch her again with that same tenderness. But the heart, as she was learning, cared very little for propriety or proper mourning periods. The first frost came in late October, coating the ground with delicate crystals that melted away as soon as the sun hit them. Kade had been preparing for winter for weeks, shoring up the barn and cutting firewood and making sure the animals had adequate shelter from the cold months ahead. Natalie helped where she could, though Thomas made everything take twice as long since she had to stop frequently to feed or change him. "Do you think we will get snow?" she asked one afternoon as they worked together to stack wood against the side of the house. "Almost certainly," Kade said, hefting another log onto the growing pile. "Not a lot usually this far south, but enough to make things difficult for a few weeks. Good thing you decided to stay here instead of trying to make it to Columbus with the baby. Winter travel is dangerous even in the best of circumstances." Natalie shuddered, thinking of what might have happened if she had been stubborn enough to try. "I made the right choice," she said quietly. "Staying here, I mean. This was the right decision." Kade paused in his work, turning to look at her. "I am glad you think so. I know this is not the life you probably imagined for yourself when you headed west with your husband, but for what it is worth, having you here has made this place feel more like a home than it ever did when I was alone." "Really?" Natalie felt her cheeks warming despite the cold air. "Really," Kade confirmed. It is nice to have someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone to share meals with. And I cannot tell you how much it means to walk in after a long day and smell something cooking that I did not have to make myself. You are a good cook, Natalie. Better than you give yourself credit for. I am learning, Natalie said, though I will admit that first loaf of bread was fairly inedible. It had character, Kade said diplomatically, and they both laughed at the memory of the dense, brick-like object that had emerged from the oven during her first attempt at baking. The laughter faded into a comfortable silence as they returned to their work, but Natalie found herself stealing glances at Kade when she thought he was not looking. He was handsome when he smiled, she thought. More than handsome. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in despite all her best intentions to remain detached and practical. That night after Thomas was asleep and the supper dishes were washed and put away, Natalie found herself lingering in the main room instead of retiring to her bedroom as she usually did. Kade was working on mending a bridle, his head bent over the leather, and she sat in the rocking chair near the fire with some sewing that did not really need to be done. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Of course." "Why have you never married? You are old enough, certainly, and you clearly have the means to support a family. I find it hard to believe no woman has ever caught your interest." Cade's hands stilled on the bridle. "There was someone once," he said slowly. "When I was younger, working on a ranch up in Colorado, the owner's daughter. Maria was her name. I thought I loved her, thought she loved me too. But when I asked her to marry me, she laughed and said she could never marry a simple cowhand with no prospects. Said she was holding out for someone with money and position, someone who could give her the kind of life she deserved." "That must have hurt terribly," Natalie said softly. "It did," Kade admitted, "but it also taught me something valuable. People can surprise you with their shallowness and their greed. After that, I decided I would rather be alone than risk opening myself up to that kind of disappointment again. I focused on saving money, on buying this land, on building something that was mine. I figured if love came along, it would come, and if it did not, well, at least I would have something solid to show for my life." "And now?" Natalie asked, her heart beating fast. "Do you still feel that way?" Kade set down the bridle and looked at her directly, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Now I am starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe some risks are worth taking after all." The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. Natalie knew she should look away, should change the subject, should retreat to the safety of propriety and proper behavior, but she found she could not move, could not tear her gaze from his. "Natalie," Kade said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not expecting anything in return. You do not owe me anything, and if what I'm about to say makes you uncomfortable, we can pretend this conversation never happened and go right back to the way things were. Do you understand?" She nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. "I am falling in love with you," Kade said simply. "Hell, I might already be in love with you. I know it is too soon. I know you are still grieving your husband. I know there are about 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore. Every day I watch you growing stronger, watch you learning and adapting and being such a good mother to Thomas, and every day I fall a little bit harder. You are brave and strong and beautiful, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore." Natalie's hands had flown to her mouth somewhere during this speech, and she felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Kade, You do not have to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "I just needed you to know. I will wait as long as you need me to wait. A year, 2 years, however long it takes for you to be ready. And if you are never ready, if you can only ever see me as a friend and an employer, I will accept that too. Your presence here is gift enough." "Stop talking," Natalie said, rising from her chair and crossing to where he sat. She took his face in her hands, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palms, and looked into his eyes. "I need to tell you something too. I thought I loved William. I truly did. But it was not the same as this. What I feel when I look at you, when I am near you, It is deeper and stronger than anything I felt in those brief months of my marriage. You saved my life, Kade. You saved Thomas's life. But more than that, you made me feel valued and capable and wanted, not because of what I could do for you, but just because of who I am. I think I started falling in love with you that very first night when you stayed beside me through the storm and helped bring my son into the world. I have just been too afraid to admit it. Natalie, Kade breathed, and then his arms were around her and his lips were on hers and the world narrowed down to the warmth of his body and the taste of his kiss. They broke apart after a long moment, both breathing hard, and Kade rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably talk about this," he said, "about what it means, how we move forward." "I know," Natalie agreed, "but can we just have this moment first? Just this one perfect moment before we have to think about practicalities and propriety and what people might say?" "We can have as many moments as you want," Kade said, pulling her closer. "Every moment from now until forever, if you will have me." "Forever sounds perfect," Natalie whispered, and kissed him again. They decided to wait a full year before marrying, both out of respect for William's memory and because Natalie wanted to be absolutely certain this was what she wanted. Not that there was much doubt in her mind. Every day she spent with Kade only reinforced her conviction that this was right, that they were right together in a way that defied logic or convention. They were careful to maintain propriety, never allowing themselves to be alone behind closed doors, keeping their affection restrained to lingering glances and hands held briefly when no one was watching. The ranch hands Kade hired in the spring to help with the work assumed Natalie was his sister or cousin, and neither of them bothered to correct the assumption. Let people think what they wanted. They knew the truth of what they were building together. Thomas took his first steps on a warm day in April, tottering across the kitchen floor into Kade's waiting arms. The cowboy scooped him up with a whoop of delight, spinning him around until the baby shrieked with laughter, and Natalie felt her heart swell with so much love she thought it might burst. This was her family, she thought. Not the family she had expected or planned for, but the family she was meant to have all along. "Did you see that?" Kade demanded. His face split with a huge grin. "He walked 3 whole steps all by himself." "I saw," Natalie said, moving to join them, wrapping her arms around both her son and the man who had become his father in every way that mattered. "He is growing up so fast." "Too fast," Kade agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Thomas's head. "Soon, he will be running all over the place, getting into everything." "Are you ready for that?" "I am ready for anything, as long as I have you two," Kade said simply, and kissed her over Thomas's dark curls. They were married in November, exactly 1 year and 1 week after the night Natalie had stumbled into Kade's barn with Thomas fighting to be born. The ceremony was small, just the preacher and a few neighbors from the surrounding ranches, but it was perfect. Natalie wore a dress of deep blue that brought out her eyes, and Kade wore a new suit that he had ordered special from town, and Thomas stood between them holding their hands and looking solemn and important in his role as witness to their union. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Kade said, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. "With everything I have and everything I am, I do." "And do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Natalie replied, her voice steady and clear. "For all the days of my life, I do." The kiss they shared when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife was sweet and tender, full of promise and hope and love. Thomas applauded with his small hands, and the guests cheered, and Natalie thought that she had never been happier than she was in this moment. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, a feast of roasted beef and fresh bread and vegetables from the garden that Natalie had tended all summer. The neighbors brought pies and cakes, and someone produced a fiddle, and soon the main room of the house was full of music and laughter and dancing. Kade swept Natalie into his arms and spun her around the room, and she laughed breathlessly, dizzy with joy and wine and the sheer wonder of it all. "Happy, Mrs. Ximenes?" Kade asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Natalie replied honestly. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for waiting." "I would have waited forever," Kade said seriously. "You are worth waiting for." They made love for the first time that night in the bed they would now share, tender and careful with each other, learning the geography of each other's bodies with reverent hands and whispered endearments. Afterward, Natalie lay with her head on Kade's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt more at peace than she had since the night her father died when she was 14. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Kade replied, his arms tightening around her. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after, I will never stop loving you, Natalie Ximenes." The years that followed were not without hardship. Ranching was hard work, and the weather did not always cooperate, and there were lean seasons when they worried about making ends meet. But they faced every challenge together, partners in every sense of the word. Natalie proved to have a knack for business that complemented Kade's skills with horses and cattle, and together they slowly built the ranch into something prosperous and sustainable. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who followed Kade everywhere, absorbing knowledge about ranching and animals like a sponge. He called Kade Papa without hesitation, and Kade loved him as fiercely as if he had been there for his conception rather than his birth. When Thomas asked about William when he was 6 years old, having heard something from one of the ranch hands, Natalie sat him down and told him the truth as gently as she could. "You had another father before Papa Kade," she said. "His name was William Winters, and he loved you very much, even though he never got to meet you. He died before you were born, which is very sad. But then Papa Kade came into our lives and became your father in all the ways that matter. We are very lucky to have him, are we not?" "Very lucky," Thomas agreed solemnly. "I am glad Papa Kade found us." "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." Natalie gave birth to a daughter when Thomas was 3 years old. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Kade feared he might lose her, might lose them both. But Natalie was tough. Tougher than she had been that first night in the storm, and she fought her way through the pain and exhaustion to bring their daughter into the world just as dawn was breaking. "A girl," Kade said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the tiny bundle in Natalie's arms. "We have a daughter." "What should we name her?" Natalie asked, exhausted but radiant. Kade thought for a moment. "What about Hope? Because that is what you brought into my life when you came to me that night. Hope for the future, hope for happiness, hope that I could have a family of my own." "Hope Ximenes." Natalie tested the name and smiled. "It is perfect." Hope grew into a spirited child with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. She was fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents, climbing trees and riding horses almost as soon as she could walk. Thomas was protective of his little sister, watching over her with the solemn intensity that children sometimes bring to their responsibilities. 2 years after Hope came another son, whom they named Elliot after Kade's father, and 3 years after that, twin girls who they called Rose and Pearl. The house rang with the sounds of children laughing and arguing and playing, and Natalie often had to stop in the middle of her work just to marvel at the life she had built. "5 children," she said to Kade one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while the younger kids played in the yard. Thomas was 16 now, tall and strong and already taking on more responsibility around the ranch. Hope was 13 and showing signs of being as good with horses as her father. Elliot was 11, quiet and studious, but with a dry sense of humor that often caught them by surprise. And the twins were 8, still young enough to be more interested in games than work. "A good number," Kade agreed, his arm around her shoulders, "though I would not complain if you wanted to try for a 6th. Natalie laughed and swatted his chest. "I am 42 years old, Kade. I think 5 is plenty." "Fair enough," he conceded. "I just like making babies with you." "We can still do that part without actually making babies," Natalie pointed out. "That is what makes it fun." Kade grinned and pulled her closer. "Cannot argue with that logic." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. The ranch stretched out before them, hundreds of acres now, with cattle dotting the hills and horses grazing in the pastures. It had taken nearly 20 years of backbreaking work to build it into what it was, but it was theirs, every inch of it, and it would belong to their children and their children's children. "Do you ever think about that night?" Natalie asked suddenly. "The storm, the barn, Thomas being born?" "All the time," Kade admitted. "It was the night my life changed forever. The night I met the woman I was meant to spend my life with, even if I did not know it yet." "I was so scared," Natalie said quietly. "I thought I was going to die. I thought the baby was going to die. And then you were there, and you were so calm and so sure, and somehow I knew everything was going to be all right." "I was terrified," Kade confessed. "I had no idea what I was doing. I just kept thinking I could not let you die, could not let that baby die. I prayed harder that night than I ever have before or since." "Well, someone was listening," Natalie said, "because here we are. 20 years later with 5 children and a thriving ranch and more happiness than I ever dreamed possible." "Here we are," Kade echoed, and kissed her temple. "Exactly where we are supposed to be." Thomas married a girl from town when he was 22, a sweet-natured school teacher named Emma who fit into the family as though she had always belonged there. They built a house on the far edge of the property, near the creek where William Winters was buried, and started a family of their own. Their first child, a son, they named William, and Natalie wept when she held him for the first time, grateful that the man who had given her Thomas would be remembered and honored by this new generation. Hope never married, declaring that she had no interest in being tied down to a husband when there was so much world to see. She became a renowned horse trainer, traveling throughout the Southwest, buying and selling and teaching others the skills her father had taught her. She came home for holidays and birthdays, bursting into the house with presents and stories and a restless energy that both exhausted and energized everyone around her. Elliot went east to college, something that had seemed impossible when he was young, but which they had managed to afford through careful saving and good years on the ranch. He studied law and returned to New Mexico to practice, opening an office in town and becoming known as a fierce advocate for homesteaders and small ranchers trying to stand up against the big cattle companies that increasingly dominated the territory. Rose and Pearl were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate without words. They both married in a double ceremony when they were 20, Rose to a doctor and Pearl to a merchant, and settled in Columbus where they opened a dress shop together that quickly became the most popular establishment in town. Kade and Natalie watched their children grow and thrive with a pride that was almost painful in its intensity. This was what they had built, they often said to each other. Not just the ranch and the land and the cattle, but this sprawling, loving, complicated family that bore witness to the power of choice and chance and love. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that seemed to include half the county. The house and barn were decorated with ribbons and flowers, and tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by friends and neighbors and family. There was music and dancing and laughter, and when Kade took Natalie in his arms for a waltz, she felt 18 again instead of 53. 25 years, she marveled. Where did the time go? Into living, Kade said simply, into building this life with you. I would not change a single moment of it, Natalie, not one. Not even the hard times, the drought year when we almost lost everything, the winter when we were all sick with influenza and you had to run the ranch by yourself while taking care of all of us. Not even those, Kade said firmly, because we survived them together, and they made us stronger. Every challenge we faced as partners. That is worth more than any amount of easy years. Thomas stood to give a toast, his own son balanced on his hip, and looked at his parents with affection and respect clear in his eyes. To Mama and Papa, he said, raising his glass, who taught us what love looks like in action, who showed us that family is not always about blood, but about choice and commitment and showing up for each other every single day. We are all so grateful for the example you set, for the home you built, for the love you showed not just to each other, but to all of us. May you have another 25 years together, and may they be filled with as much joy as the first." "Hear, hear," echoed around the room, and Natalie buried her face in Kade's shoulder to hide the tears streaming down her cheeks. They did not get another 25 years, but they got close. Kade died peacefully in his sleep at 74, his hand clasped in Natalie's, after a short illness that left him weak, but still himself until the very end. His last words were to tell her he loved her, and then he was gone, slipping away as gently as a leaf falling from a tree. Natalie grieved him deeply, but without bitterness. They had been given 48 years together, which was more than many couples received, and every one of those years had been a gift. She wore black for a year and then put it away, knowing Kade would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life in mourning. She lived another 7 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren who called her Gigi and climbed into her lap to hear stories about the old days. She told them about the storm and the barn and the cowboy who had delivered her baby and stolen her heart. She told them about building the ranch from nothing, about droughts and good years, and the 1,000 small moments that made up a life. "Was he your true love?" her great-granddaughter asked once, a romantic child of 10 who devoured storybooks like candy. "He was," Natalie said with certainty. "He absolutely was. I had another husband before your great-grandfather, and I loved him in a way, but Kade was my true love, the person I was meant to find, and I am so grateful that I did." Natalie Ximenes died in her sleep on a cool autumn night, 78 years old and surrounded by love. Her children buried her next to Kade on the hill overlooking the creek, and the whole county seemed to turn out for her funeral. The preacher spoke about her strength and her kindness and the legacy she left behind, but Thomas said it best in his eulogy. "My mother taught me that love is a choice we make every day," he said, his voice steady despite his grief. "That family can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best things we will ever know. She came to this land as a frightened widow about to give birth in a storm, and she left it as a beloved matriarch whose impact will be felt for generations. We are all better for having known her, and the love she shared with my father is the foundation on which all of our lives are built." The ranch stayed in the family, passing through the generations just as Kade had dreamed it would. Thomas's children and grandchildren worked the land, and Hope's descendants brought in new bloodlines for the horses, and Elliot's legal expertise helped protect the property from developers and corporations who wanted to buy them out. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original barn still stood, maintained with care as a reminder of the night that had changed everything. On the wall of that barn, carefully carved into the wood and protected from the weather, someone had inscribed the date, November 1876, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "Where our story began." It was a good story in the end. Not the story Natalie had expected when she set out from Philadelphia as a new bride, full of naive dreams about frontier life. But it was a better story, richer and deeper, and full of the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. It was a story about survival and choice, and the strange ways that fate brings people together. It was a story about a storm and a barn and a cowboy who stayed beside a frightened woman through the darkest night of her life and ended up staying beside her through all the nights that followed. It was, quite simply, a story about love. The kind of love that endures through hardship and joy alike, the kind that grows stronger with every passing year, the kind that leaves a legacy measured not in acres or cattle or money, but in the hearts of those who come after. That kind of love, rare and precious and true, was what Kade and Natalie Ximenes built together in that little ranch house in New Mexico, and it would echo through their family for all the generations to come. The rain that had brought them together had long since soaked into the earth, feeding the grass and the trees and all the living things that depended on it. But the love that bloomed in that barn during the storm, the connection forged between two strangers in the midst of crisis, that remained evergreen and vital, a testament to the power of compassion and courage and the human capacity for connection. Every baby born into the family, every couple that married, every child that took their first steps on that land, they were all part of that original story, the one that began with a desperate woman and a kind man and a tiny baby fighting to be born. And sometimes, on stormy nights when the wind howled and the rain battered the roof, the descendants of Kade and Natalie Ximenes would gather in that old barn and tell the story again. They would talk about the storm and the birth and the cowboy who stayed even when he could have turned away. They would talk about the love that grew from that unlikely beginning, about the family that was built on a foundation of compassion and choice. And they would feel grateful, profoundly grateful, that on one wild night in November 1876, a pregnant widow stumbled into a barn in the middle of a storm and found not just shelter, but home.